Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the King's College community for what is our keynote address for Black History Month and our celebration thereof. For all attendees, let me point you in the direction of the chat box on your Zoom and call attention to the text number that you can use to put in questions that you have throughout today's presentation. Following the lecture, our own Dr. David Tubbs will moderate a discussion and the Q&A with our keynote speaker, Dr. Lucas Morel. Dr. Morel is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics and the head of the Politics Department at Washington and Lee University. He holds a Ph.D. in political science from Claremont Graduate University. His research interests include Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Ralph Ellison. Professor Morel is former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, a consultant on Library of Congress exhibits on Lincoln and the Civil War, and currently serves on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, which will plan activities to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States. He's the author of several books, most recently, Lincoln and the American Founding, published in 2020. The topic Dr. Morel will address today is one that I think is historically significant and frankly, modernly relevant. At this time in our history, and certainly during this month, we look to exemplars that we can emulate the best qualities of in our pursuit of good citizenship and effective political interactions. And so it gives me great pleasure now to welcome Professor Morel and look forward very much to your remarks, sir. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you, President Gibson, for your generous welcome to the King's College and Professor Tubbs and all the support staff for arranging this event. Believe me, I wish I could be there in person with you, especially get to know your students. As you can tell by my accent, I grew up in Southern California, but the truth of the matter is I was actually born in Manhattan. So somewhere along the lines lost what little accent I picked up as a baby. And sorry for that, but I would have loved to have joined you, a bit of a homecoming for me, if I were to join you guys on campus to deliver this Black History Month address. The idea for a month to set aside to focus on Black contribution to America began actually as what was known as a Negro History Week. Its creator was Dr. Carter G. Woodson. He was a Harvard-trained historian and the son of former slaves. He envisioned what he called Negro History Week as a way to address the problem of incomplete American history, which is to say biased American history. And so he chose the second week in February in honor of what he considered two great contributors to Black America and America generally. And that was, those two men were Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, who were both born in February. This annual commemoration of Black achievement was a kind of public service announcement. It was a way to bolster Black pride in his mind, as well as alleviate white ignorance. Hence a means of reducing racial prejudice in the United States. Woodson believed that this annual commemoration would teach Black Americans, quote, to love this country, which they and their forefathers have done so much to develop. And he added that what really should be emphasized was not Negro history, but as he put it, the Negro in history. It's in that spirit that we should study and therefore appreciate one of the greatest Americans who ever lived, and that was Frederick Douglass. How did Frederick Douglass help Americans reduce the gap between what they profess to believe and how they actually act, that gap between profession and practice? With so much discussion today about systemic racism, we hear little about America's systemic justice, by which I mean the principles and institutions which Douglass found in the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, which he believed held the key to the abolition of slavery and eventually full and equal citizenship before the law. Without America's ideals and America's system, constitutional and political system of justice, this country would not have seen any progress in securing the rights of its citizens of color, what I consider the long civil rights movement that constitutes our nation's history since its birth in 1776. In speaking of systems, Douglass distinguished between the Constitution and our cultural institutions like the church and the operators of these institutions. The flaws of this nation, he thought they were significant. He located in the people who employed these institutions and systems, and these, of course, shaped the thoughts and practices of the American people. So I call this lecture, Frederick Douglass, The Making of an American. We'll see that Douglass wasn't always patriotic about the nation of his birth. We can never forget that he was born into American slavery. How he became one of the most eloquent advocates of America, what he discovered about a country that for many years did not secure his rights as a man and his rights as a citizen, that's our task today. And I'm looking forward to the question and answer period to develop these even further. Next to William Lloyd Garrison, there was no more famous abolitionist in the late 1830s, well, in the 1840s, shall we say. Next to William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of the abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, there was nobody more famous than Frederick Douglass. One book published about a couple of years ago said it's fair to say that Frederick Douglass was the most photographed man in America in the 19th century. He was born into slavery in Easton, Maryland, February 1818. Of course, we don't know his exact day of birth because they didn't keep those records, although he claims to have recalled his mother speaking to him as my little Valentine. And so we'll call it Valentine's Day for Douglass. He escaped 20 years later, and in 1845 wrote his most famous work, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, and then he added, written by himself. Soon after its publication, though, he had to flee the United States because in his book, he was very detailed about how he fled. He named names. And at least in the eyes of the law, he was outside of the law's protection because he was what was known at the time as a fugitive slave. So he fled to the United Kingdom and toured Ireland, Scotland, England, until friends of his, both abolitionists in the United States and in Great Britain, they paid for his manumission. I think it was 150 pounds sterling silver, which was about 750 bucks at the time. He commented at the time that he wouldn't pay 1 red cent for his own freedom, but of course did not mind that his friends would do so, that it would enable him to come back to the land of his birth and to work for the cause, of course, to free all of America's slaves. He soon edited his own newspaper called the North Star, and he wrote and spoke almost daily to emancipate slaves and rid the nation of color prejudice. He thought if you got rid of color prejudice, that would pull the rug out from under all of the other institutions and social practices that were governed by the color line. He was a close observer of one of my favorite president, Abraham Lincoln. And during the Civil War, despite being a very fierce critic of Lincoln, he came to appreciate the president's efforts on behalf of emancipation and Black enlistment in the armed forces. After the war, he was eventually appointed U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia and was a minister to Haiti. He was a long time early adopter, if you will, advocate for women's rights. And in fact, was attending a meeting at the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C., where he then lived in Anacostia, the morning of his death on February 20th, 1895. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a leading activist of the women's rights movement, she recalled watching Frederick Douglass give a speech, and this is what she said, and she wrote later. He stood there like an African prince, majestic in his wrath, as with wit, satire, and indignation, he graphically described the bitterness of slavery and the humiliation of subjection to those who in all human virtues and powers were inferior to himself. His ferocity of spirit was matched by a fierce intelligence that produced not only his renowned narrative, the first of 3 autobiographies, but also speeches and editorials that continue to stand as lasting contributions to the progress of liberty in this country. That intelligence led a man who had every reason to hate the United States to become one of her greatest defenders. Early in his career as an abolition speaker, Douglas said, "I have no love for America. I have no patriotism. I have no country." He then asked, "What country have I? The institutions of this country do not know me. They do not recognize me as a man." Those institutions were the major shapers of American life: the church, the government, and at least at that time, what he understood as the Constitution. Given that American slavery could not exist without the cooperation of the northern free states with the southern slaveholding states, Douglas declared of the federal government at this time, and this is about 1847, "I desire to see its overthrow as speedily as possible." The Constitution, he said, shivered into 1,000 fragments. By this point in his speaking career, he was used to being heckled with racial epithets, pelted with rotten eggs. They actually did that back then. Navigating his way through anti-abolition mobs, and this is in New England. That was what was going on in the United States in the 1840s. His condemnation of the American government and the Constitution made him few friends among those not already in the abolition camp, which was at that time and for decades a fringe element of society in antebellum America. You didn't invite these guys to your parties. Until 1849, Frederick Douglass could not love a country that did not love him. To his credit, and I argue to America's credit, he did not hold that position for long. He eventually claimed America as his country. He called the principles of the Declaration of Independence in 1852, very famous speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." He said that the principles of the Declaration were saving principles. And then he called the Constitution a glorious liberty document. He found that reading the Constitution the way his mentor, William Lloyd Garrison, did, as a pro-slavery document, contradicted its preamble and overlooked the principles and mechanisms of freedom that were contained therein. Douglass also noticed that the Constitution never used the word slave or slavery. It permitted Congress to ban the importation of slaves in 1808. And therefore, he said it leans to freedom, not slavery, and looked to the abolition of slavery rather than to its perpetuity. So in a public career that spanned half a century, Douglass joined a vanguard of Blacks and whites in the struggle to align this nation's practices with its noblest professions. That struggle began as a personal one when he decided to free himself from the legal bondage into which he was born. In his narrative, Douglass famously recounts an incident when he decided to resist a flogging at the hands of an overseer named Edward Covey. And this is Douglass. He says, "Mr. Covey seemed to think he had me and could do what he pleased. But at this moment, from whence came the spirit, I don't know. I resolved to fight. And suiting my action to the resolution, I seized Covey hard by the throat. And as I did so, I rose." Douglass called it the turning point of his career as a slave, as he put it. And he resolved that however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. I did not hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping me must also succeed in killing me. In his second autobiography, published in 1855, My Bondage and My Freedom, Douglass commented, "I had reached the point at which I was not afraid to die. This spirit made me a free man in fact, while I remained a slave in form." The president's, After the war, Douglass was eventually appointed U.S. Marshal of the District of Columbia. I left that part out. So what do we make of this account in his autobiography? Douglas, I argue, took the measure of his oppressive circumstances, and most especially of his God-given capacity as a human being, and determined not to remain a victim of his environment. He would pursue his own liberation and that of his fellow bondsmen, eventually making a career of reminding Americans of the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the protections, as he understood them, of the Constitution. Remarkably, when his race was held against him, as he exercised the rights of a free man and the rights of an American, Douglas never took it to heart. One time he was forced to ride in a baggage car because of his, what he would call, unpopular color. While white friends apologized for the insulting treatment, and he said, "They cannot degrade Frederick Douglass. The soul that is within me, no man can degrade." A few weeks after Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Douglas gave a lecture. It was entitled "Popular Error and Unpopular Truth." He said, "There's no such thing as a new truth. Error might be old or new, but truth was as old as the universe." Of Lincoln's proclamation, Douglas said, "A fatal blow had at last been struck at the root of the gigantic evil. The president's proclamation had given the slaves the legal right to liberty. Now they could obtain their personal freedom without trampling upon civil laws." Notice his respect for the rule of law. He recognized that his own physical escape to freedom, even though it was entirely just in terms of the laws of nature, it violated the laws of man. And the chief aim of self-government was to make the civil laws comport with what he called the laws of nature and of nature's God, as the Declaration puts it. As Douglas suggests, to act consistent with the laws of nature should never contradict the laws of one's community. Like a good American, Douglas understood the true purpose of government, and that was to protect, not rob or deprive human beings of the liberty with which they were born. So he saw in the Emancipation Proclamation a formal, legal, political process by which those enslaved by the laws of human beings would be freed up to exercise their natural rights, laws that the human laws should have been enshrining all along. This was an important observation. It was born of America's own founding as a nation based upon timeless truths. The idea of universal natural rights was what Douglas considered an unpopular truth. Unpopular because until the 1770s, no nation on earth operated according to what Americans held to be, or at least declared to be, self-evidently true. Douglas noted that with the Emancipation Proclamation, Mr. Lincoln had dared to apply the old truth of human liberty to his time. He has dared to declare the truth of the Declaration. With Lincoln and the founders, Douglas believed human equality was one of those truths as old as the universe. Under the pressure of a civil war, the self-evident truth that all men are created equal would begin to be secured for Black Americans. But it was chiefly, according to Douglas, a contest of words, not a battle of arms, to which he attributed the abolition of slavery. Though wrung out by the stern dictates of military necessity, he said, it was in reality a moral necessity. Without what he called a principle in man which induces him to accept truth, he held little hope for progress in human affairs. For him, speech, meaning an appeal to right through reason, not violence, held the key to the progress of liberty, to the security of the law in America. He pointed out that it was slavery that required violations of free speech, but he was confident that, quote, truth must triumph under a system of free discussion, end quote. He even affirmed Thomas Jefferson's confidence, quote, that error might be left free so long as the truth was free to combat it. But he added, equally true, though not always equally manifest, is it that error can never be safely tolerated when truth is not left free to combat it. Freedom of speech for Douglas was not some abstract principle, but the very engine of a society that intended to rule itself by reason rather than through force or intimidation. He knew the insecurity of slaveholding societies. They censored the mails of abolition publications. They mobbed speakers who spoke of human equality and abolition. And they even prohibited slaves like Frederick Douglass in Maryland from learning how to read. Of all the deprivations Douglass attributed to slavery, the denial of an education he ranked as the worst of slavery's evils. He said, quote, "It would forever unfit him to be a slave." He was quoting his master when he discovered Douglass was being taught his letters and how to spell. "From that moment," Douglass note, "I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom." A simple thing like learning how to read indicated to him that human beings possess the freedom to think and to make choices about how to live. That was the key to progress in human civilization. In focusing upon human equality and individual rights, principles he learned, again, in America, Douglass departed from those who wanted to connect Black Americans to a so-called African past. A steadfast opponent of Black colonization or emigration back to Africa, as Marcus Garvey would put it at the turn of the century, Douglass discounted the value of reclaiming an African heritage for Blacks in America. As he put it quite frankly, all this native land talk is nonsense. The native land of the American Negro is America. It is a mark of their perception, fortitude, resilience, and even good humor that Africans on American soil, in the face of pervasive racial bigotry, nevertheless became Americans in terms of what they thought politically and religiously, denied the right to vote most of the time in most of the states. Blacks remained persuaded that government by consent of the governed was the only true foundation of civil government, denied membership in most American churches throughout most of American history. Blacks still converted on the main to the Christian faith. Through it all, Douglass wrote, "Our hearts believed while they ached and bled." In the face of color prejudice, Blacks had taken Americans, white Americans, at their word. All men are created equal. And believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you shall be saved. And so they were committed to making a life and a future for themselves and their posterity in the land of their birth. For generations, that land was America. After many a thousand gone, if America was not the land of these many generations of Black Americans, what land could be? Douglass was unwilling to let their many contributions and sacrifices go unappreciated and unrewarded. An American past for him, not an African past, was where Blacks in America should be looking for a heritage to claim as their own. This argument against Black colonization or mass immigration of Blacks away from America can be applied to African heritage arguments that Douglass believed, quote, weaken the Negro's hold on one country, end quote. And I think this is a profound observation by Douglass, for much of white American prejudice that informed their practice, legal and social, gave Black Americans plenty of reasons not to hold on to, let alone love the land of their birth. Douglass, however, placed great stock in how much Blacks had actually contributed to the development of this country, despite the many ways the nation fell short of fulfilling its promise to all of its citizens. And so Douglass concluded, quote, our people should be let alone and given a fair chance to work out their own destiny where they are. So whatever gave Black Americans reason to look abroad for their real home, while they remained here in America, Douglass thought would forever keep them from being viewed and accepted and treated as full members of the American community. The result, in Douglass's words, we do not take a firm hold upon the advantages and opportunities right before us. Tell Black Americans that their native land is Africa, that their true home is anywhere but where they currently reside, and intend to make a life for themselves? Douglas answered, this mindset kept blacks, quote, in an unsettled condition and in constant state of alarm. It paralyzes their energies and breaks up and destroys the sentiment of patriotism. Regarding America's white majority, he thought it unwise of them to do such violence to the love of home and country, as he put it. In fact, he thought white Americans should be hailing with joy every loyal man who has an arm and a heart to fight as a kinsman, to be marshaled to the defense and protection of a common country. Douglas summed this up by stating that, quote, permanent location is a mighty element of civilization. He believed that when people have a country, a neighborhood, a home, they have what he called a powerful motive for the cultivation of an honorable character. He thought that no people can prosper or amount to much unless they have a home or the hope of a home. For blacks to be truly at home in the United States, this would require the cooperation of white Americans. Douglas eventually, as I noted earlier, identified himself with the land of his birth, especially as it was a nation based upon what he called human brotherhood and the self-evident truths of liberty and equality. The Black American of his day, let alone ours, owed far less to Africa than he did to ancestors who lived and labored and died on American soil. Not to mention the fact that millions of his posterity have inherited Caucasian blood. Douglas added, what other country could Black Americans call their own whose ancestors are white and Black? With this conviction, he devoted himself to getting white Americans, quote, to trust the operation of their own principles, end quote. And in this, he foreshadowed, I believe, Justice Lewis Harlan's famous dissent in the infamous 1896 court case, Plessy v. Ferguson. And this is that case that produced the infamous, the insidious doctrine of separate but equal. Harlan wrote, our Constitution is colorblind, neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. 30 years earlier, Frederick Douglass observed simply that the Constitution, quote, knows no distinction between citizens on account of color. And after the Civil War, Douglass stated that his goal was to make our government entirely consistent with itself. So here Douglass noticed a tremendous advantage that Black Americans had in their struggle for civil and political rights in this country. Most white Americans at least claimed to believe in those principles of fairness and equality under the law. This belief was so strong that they wrote it in their most authoritative documents, the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. It was there for all to see. So when Martin Luther King Jr., many years later, remarked, all we say to America is that to be true to what you said on paper, he was channeling the muse of Frederick Douglass. When King said, somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly, somewhere I read of the freedom of speech, somewhere I read of the freedom of the press, King drew attention to those same levers of freedom that Douglass saw as he lived among his oppressors, right? The grand irony is they put it in writing. So Blacks had something to work with. After all, somewhere I read, there was a time in American history when a portion of white America changed its mind about its political principles, especially those that should govern a nation of many different races. These white Americans were a minority of the nation, but a large enough minority that they attempted to establish a new country based on new principles, the foremost of which was white supremacy. This was, of course, the Confederate States of America. They made the enslavement of Black people a fundamental principle of their new and improved Constitution, where the old Constitution, the Constitution of Washington and Madison and Hamilton, never mentioned slavery explicitly until the nation decided to abolish it in the 13th Amendment. The Confederate Constitution explicitly provided for its protection in several of its provisions. It mentioned both race and slavery. What lever could a Black person have in the Confederacy to secure liberty by the rule of laws and courts? To what principles of freedom and equality or government by consent Could a Black person appeal in a nation who, according to its vice president, Alexander Stevens, a nation whose foundations are laid and cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. Stevens said, "This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world, based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. Blacks could claim no civil right, no political, no constitutional right in this systematically racist confederacy." So Douglass concluded that the burden of the Black man's appeal, his demand upon the American people, was what he called justice and fair play. He said, "We utterly repudiate all invidious distinctions, whether in our favor or against us. We only ask for a fair field and no favor." Douglass found those principles inherent in the American founding. As President Bill Clinton said in his first inaugural address, I think the best thing he ever said as a politician, he said, "Our democracy must not only be the envy of the world, but the engine of our own renewal. There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America." But as much as Douglass did to promote the uplift of Blacks in America, he was not, interestingly enough, a fan of what we call today race pride. He said it was a false foundation and a positive evil. He proclaimed it was the very thing we're fighting against. For the better part of American history, Black Americans wanted nothing to do with a color line. Douglass wrote that it was our enemies who sought to, quote, "deepen and widen the line of separation between the white and colored portion of the population." Given that Blacks were a numerical minority in America, color had never been a help for them. So where Douglass learned from the writings of slaveholders, yes, like Washington, like Jefferson, like Madison, was that the only relevant minority in America was the minority of one, the individual. In Douglass's words, color should not be a criterion of rights. He recognized that the protection of the rights of a specific group, white people, was actually harming his group, Black people. The politics of racial identity, he thought, diverted government away from protecting the rights of every individual and towards assigning benefits and burdens according to whatever interest group controlled the government. And so Douglass concluded, "I know of no rights of race superior to the rights of humanity." He was a steadfast believer in equality under the law, and he did not believe that race should be the measure of anyone's constitutional rights. His argument against race pride also led him to criticize what he called complexional institutions. Over a decade before Lincoln was elected president, Douglass said that all distinctions founded on complexion ought to be repealed, repudiated, and forever abolished. Every right, privilege, and immunity now enjoyed by the white man ought to be as freely granted to the man of color. He thought that, quote, "colored conventions, colored exhibitions, colored associations, and institutions were hindrances rather than helps in achieving a higher and better estimation in the public mind of Black people as a race." He understood that white prejudice north and south of the Mason-Dixon line would compel Blacks to form what he called complexional institutions as a stopgap measure. But he argued that this short-term resort to Black associations and institutions was not good in principle. He thought it reinforced a racial mindedness that those organizations were set up to eliminate. He believed an emphasis upon race was a losing proposition for Blacks in America. Instead of equal protection of the laws, Douglass declared, "You lay down a rule for the Black man that you apply to no other class of your citizens." So when he was asked the misbegotten, stupid question, "What shall be done with the Negro when freed?" he answered with 3 words, and he meant to be provocative. "Let us alone. Do nothing with us," he continued, "for us or by us as a particular class. I affirm that the broadest and bitterest of the Black man's misfortunes is the fact that he is everywhere regarded and treated as an exception to the principles and maxims that apply to other men. He argued that so long as Blacks were seen and treated as exceptions, color prejudice would continue, and they would never be seen as full members of the American community. Now that I have your attention, did Douglass really mean that Black Americans should be let alone? Do nothing? Really? He went on to explain. All I ask is give him a chance to stand on his own legs. If you see him on his way to school, let him alone. Don't disturb him. If you see him going to the dinner table at a hotel, let him go. If you see him going to the ballot box, let him alone. Don't disturb him. If you see him going into a workshop, just let him alone. Your interference is doing him a positive injury. So, Black Americans pursuing a job, an education, the vote. Does the government owe a Black person, any person, anything when it comes to these vital pursuits? It was in 1865 when Douglass made these statements. His audience knew the context of his examples. In fact, Blacks were not given a chance to stand on their own legs. They were harassed, persecuted, even killed in their attempts to learn, to eat, to vote, and to learn a trade. To be left alone, as Douglass insisted, did not mean to be left to the mercy of a mob. It meant to be protected by the government, no more and no less than any other American citizen. This is what he meant by equality under the law, which is why the vote was so important to Douglass. To be freed from an individual master, but not be allowed to vote, was simply to become, as he put it, the slave of the community. Douglass concluded where universal suffrage is the rule, where that is the fundamental idea of the government, and to rule us out is to make us an exception and to brand us with the stigma of inferiority, and to invite to our heads the missiles of those about us. And so he had given many reasons, many times, why Black people should have the right to vote. But this concern for public opinion, what a ban against Black voting taught white people regarding the humanity of Blacks, let alone their citizenship, he said this was a longstanding priority for Douglass. He insisted that the vote be granted to Blacks, not because they were Black, but because they were citizens. The government of all should be partial to none. Instead of living as an exception to the rules that applied to others, he said Blacks should integrate with the majority white population as much as possible. They should, quote, make themselves and be made by others a part of the American people in every sense of the word. He encouraged Blacks not to self-segregate. He said, we should distribute ourselves among the people. And I love this example. He said, build our houses where if they take fire, others will be in danger. Common dangers will produce common safeguards. By participating in these organizations that are run by whites, he said Blacks could become members and leaders of these organizations over time. They would learn how these organizations operated, gain experience and skills, and best of all, work alongside whites, which would afford examples of character and competence on the part of Blacks that would chip away at color prejudice. For Douglass, the way to eliminate racial bigotry was to become a part of the whole, not to be, as he put it, the whole of a part. So let American history be our guide here. If the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments required a Black majority in Congress in order to pass, let alone be ratified in the states, how secure would the rights of Black Americans be? How much political progress would the nation have made if color and not citizenship, if race and not our humanity characterized the political practice of this country? Surely the progress Americans have made on this front have had everything to do with the principle of human equality taking hold over more and more Americans, most of whom were white. In 1954, there were no Black Supreme Court justices, and yet unanimously, they handed down on May 17th, 1954, the Brown v. Board of Education decision, which desegregated public schools K through 12 throughout the United States. In 1964, there were no Black senators when the Civil Rights Act was passed, and way few Black representatives. Ditto for 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was passed. And so the point here being, a whole lot of white people had come around to seeing that they needed to have their practice aligned more consistently with their profession, with their principles. Black people helped them see that. And those white majorities helped those Black people become full citizens. When Frederick Douglass died on February 20th, 1895, a resolution was proposed in the United States Senate to allow his body, quote, to lie in state in the rotunda of the national Capitol, end quote. He would have been the first Black American accorded this honor, but the resolution was rejected on a motion by a senator from his own home state of Maryland. Talk about your missed opportunities. After a funeral in Washington, D.C., where his body was viewed by thousands in the morning, his body was sent to Rochester, New York, where he used to live, and there it lay in state at City Hall before he was buried. There is now, thankfully, a statue of Frederick Douglass in the Capitol Visitor Center in Washington, D.C. And so in becoming an American, Douglass, I believe, helped America become a better version of itself. He helped motivate Black Americans to strive to improve themselves even before unjust barriers to their freedom were removed. He also challenged white Americans to see the ways in which they fell short of their highest professions. Like Lincoln, Frederick Douglass called the nation back to its founding, the principles of the Declaration, the levers of freedom in the Constitution, as the surest guide to the equal protection of every American's civil and political rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Morel, for that very stimulating lecture. You covered a remarkable amount of Douglass's life in 40 minutes. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions coming in. A few came in during your lecture, so I would like to begin with those. Start with one question that's straightforward and purely historical. Did Frederick Douglass work together with or regularly speak with Harriet Tubman?
He knew of Tubman, but they were not collaborators as it were. I think fundamentally for the reason that, there's a number of reasons, but the fundamental reason is that Tubman was not the orator that Douglass was, and Douglass was not the activist that Tubman was in terms of literally spiriting the enslaved from their legal masters into the North or to Canada. And so Tubman had she was working her side of the civil rights field, and Douglass was working his side. And so Douglass learned fairly early that his principal contribution, right, he was too old to fight in the Civil War, even though his sons did. His principal contribution was going to become, was to be a speaker, an orator, and an editor of an abolitionist newspaper, but mostly by giving speeches. That was Douglass's forte. That was his principal contribution. And so Tubman, as I say, was more practical. She freed herself and tried to free as many other people at great risk to herself. Remarkable. So not a whole lot of formal collaboration that I know of.
Okay. Second question. This is a question broad in scope. It's about Alexis de Tocqueville's observations on the religious life of the American people, American religiosity. And so the question is, did Frederick Douglass understand it in roughly the same way? Did he affirm the religiosity of white Americans? Or was the racial prejudice of a predominantly Christian population a significant issue for Frederick Douglass? Did he write about the religiosity of white Americans in his time?
One might argue that he almost never stopped writing, certainly speaking about the faux Christianity of the white majority in this country. He famously said slavery couldn't last an hour outside of the church or it lasting an hour in the church. He thought if Christians were true Christians and lived according to the Bible that he read and preached early in his life, if they lived up to the teachings of the Holy Scriptures, both Old and New Testament, slavery would disappear yesterday. And so he was and this got him into trouble with well-meaning people, both white and black, especially north of the Mason-Dixon line. He was a consistent critic of the white American church. Again, not for what the scriptures said, but for how it was interpreted. And one of his early shticks, if you will, was he would use part of his speech to give what he called the slaveholder's sermon, right? Where, you preach, and, there's a couple of passages in the New Testament where at least a Baldwin's interpretation could be made, where, slaves obey your masters, basically. So he would riff on that, right? But not a whole lot about the golden rule and treating others as you would be treated, et cetera. Not a whole lot about the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. And so alas for Douglas, I think, if you read David Blight's, there it is, great biography of Frederick Douglass, over and over and over again, a consistent theme of his is how far short the American church fell in this regard. White churches that did not allow him to worship or sent him upstairs in a segregated way, and black churches that, of course, were in favor of abolition, but did little to support it financially. And also, they didn't want to jeopardize their own status in Northern society. And so they would say, hey, Douglas, why don't you take it down about 1,000? And Douglas could not believe that not every black church was making abolition front and center, God's intention for America. So would love to have seen a conversation between him and Alexis Tocqueville.
On that last point, you said during your lecture, if I could just follow up, because that I think is a very helpful answer. You said during the lecture that abolitionism really was 1840s, a fringe movement.
Yes.
Probably hard for Americans living today to appreciate that fully. Would you like to elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, that's a great, I'm going to say it's a great question because you're quoting me. That's not what I mean by that. It's great because I get this question every time I teach my race and equality class. I get it every time I teach my Lincoln Statesmanship seminar. And I teach both those courses every year at Washington and Lee, down here in Old Virginia. Here is what we don't understand today. We think, good grief, this is a slam dunk. All men are created equal. It's in English. How do we not understand that? Why didn't we live up to that? Why would abolitionism be seen as a fringe element of society? Unfortunately, especially because of the influence of Wendell Phillips and especially William Lloyd Garrison, whom I mentioned earlier. Douglas was a protege of Garrison until 1849, when he started editing his own newspaper. Garrison's rhetoric, if you know anything about William Lloyd Garrison, here's the guy who calls the Constitution a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, right? Here's a guy that you always knew where you stood with Garrison. And even Douglas, I quoted this on purpose. Douglas, early in his speaking career, spoke of the dissolution of the Union and said that the Constitution should be shivered into 1,000 fragments. Garrison in 1850, I want to say 54, burns a copy of the United States Constitution in public. Polite, decent, well-meaning people don't do that. In other words, abolitionism became synonymous with undermining the rule of law, especially the rule of the supreme law of the land, which was the Constitution. And so unfortunately, abolitionists, and Douglas got roped into this because he used to hang out, he was a fellow traveler with Garrison. Abolitionists got the reputation of being subversive, not militarily subversive. Garrison was a pacifist, okay? But they were subversive of the Constitution, they were subversive of compromise, they were subversive of the ordinary give and take of politics that gets manifested when you allow people to express their consent, right? Well, as long as government by consent of the governed was the operative principle, okay, then you were never going to get all the justice that people deserve. You got as much justice as popular opinion and majority sentiment would support. And the abolitionists were just too absolutist for that. And so to wrap this up, the Liberator, Garrison's abolition newspaper, had on its masthead, "No union with slaveholders." And what he meant by that was literally no union. We let our erring sisters go, okay? In other words, we want to be free of the taint of having to, for example, enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, which the Constitution as a compromise obliged the national legislators, the congressmen, to enforce, right? The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, which was revised in 1850, notorious Fugitive Slave Act, which gave birth to Uncle Tom's Cabin, according to Harry Beecher Stowe. So it's because of this lack of respect for the rule of law that abolitionists had, and that reputation, that, if you will, a decent American thought, no, I don't want to have any part of that.
Very helpful, very helpful. There was one question that you answered in passing. If I could modify the question just ever so slightly, the question was, do you have a biography of Frederick Douglass that you recommend? That you mentioned David Blight's biography. That's a big tome.
It is,
right? Maybe is there a shorter volume that you might recommend to busy undergraduates?
Yeah, okay. It depends on what you want to do. If it's really about his own life, and again, every autobiography should be read with a grain of salt. In other words, they aren't going to tell you the unvarnished truths about themselves, right? So if you're reading the autobiography of Malcolm X or Douglas's 3 autobiographies, he's going to leave some stuff out, obviously. And he's got an agenda. It's a political agenda. The shortest of the biographies, because it was published early, is the 1845. The one most famous, the one that most likely, if anybody has read Frederick Douglass, they've read the narrative. And it's very, I mean, it's like, it's very slender. So if you want to know about Douglass up until he meets William Lloyd Garrison, after he escapes from his legal master, Hugh Auld, you read the narrative. But I'm a political scientist, and so I want to know this guy's mind. I want to know his thinking. And you learn someone's thoughts by what they say and what they write. And so for me, it's the biography, while important, because after all, he freed himself. And that was an important part of his message to Blacks who were enslaved or segregated. I want to know what he said in his speeches and his editorials. There I see the full flowering of his liberalism, if you will, his enlightened way of thinking. And so get yourself, as you can see here, a good single volume of Frederick Douglass's writings. So there's a number of them. Nicholas Bucala has published like the 50 essential Douglass documents. If I had edited that one, there would be, probably half a dozen that I would change, but we're all peculiar that way. So I would say read his writings. The narrative you can knock off in a night, but get to his speeches, get to his editorials. The selected writings that were edited by Philip Foner and Yuval Taylor. It's a chunk. So Nicholas Bucala's single volume is good. If you want a scholar's rendering of Douglass's, what I'm calling his liberal mind, his Enlightenment thinking, the best book, bar none, is by my pal at UW, Wisconsin Eau Claire, Peter Myers, his book on Frederick Douglass. And that's maybe 200-300 pages long. I think that's the best thing. And I teach Douglass for a living. I think Pete's book on Frederick Douglass's liberalism, if you will, I think nothing compares with it. I think it's the best thing out there.
A quick follow-up here. A question came in just a minute ago. Do you have a favorite speech by Douglass, or one speech that you think
that's like asking me my favorite,
essential for all American undergraduates to read?
The most famous and arguably his best speech is one I mentioned in my lecture. It's called, it comes under 2 titles. What to the Slave is the 4th of July. Sometimes I've seen it titled, What to the Negro is the 4th of July. But I think it's most commonly referred to as What to the Slave is the 4th of July. It was a speech he gave July 5th, 1852. And it was his first not comprehensive, but it was his first public announcement that he was no longer a Garrisonian, that he no longer was preaching the pro-slavery Constitution line. It was his first full-throated defense of the Constitution as what he called a glorious liberty document. It's a longish speech. I don't know that it's his longest, but it's a long speech, but it is chock full of, that is the best springboard, in my opinion, off of which students could get into the grander corpus of Douglass's writings. And for this reason, Blight argues that it's like a 3-part symphony. I see it as generally 2 parts. The first part, he is all praise for the founders. and nary a mention about the fact that they're slaveholders. Because in 1852, he is going after his generation of Americans. And so the second half of his speech is about, oh, you know, all these guys that I said were so cool and great and awesome and those principles and you rah, rah, rah. How come you guys aren't living up to them? How come you aren't doing more to look like our fathers? We have Washington to our father, right? Alluding to the New Testament. We have Abraham to our father. Douglass went after his own generation, you know, hammer and tong. And so I think that contrast of his praise for the founders, in spite of the fact that they were slaveholders, and his condemnation and critique of the current generation of Americans and the ways they fell short of living up to the Declaration. They fell short of interpreting the Constitution as a liberty document. That is a wonderful exercise. You could spend an entire class period, as I do, just on that speech. I've got other favorites, but that one is, you got to start there. My second most favorite one is his 1876 oration to Abraham Lincoln when they dedicated the Freedmen's Memorial in Washington, D.C. And that, in my opinion, is the best assessment by a contemporary of Lincoln's presidency. And so I would, those are my like Mount Everest and K2 of speeches by Frederick Douglass.
Thank you. Very helpful. There is a question about contemporary Black conservatism in the United States, African-American conservative thought today. The question, if I understand it correctly, is, do you think Frederick Douglass would endorse contemporary African-American conservative political thought, the worldview of African-American conservatives?
It would be helpful if I had a name that went along with what you're referring to as Black conservatism. I think of conservative very basically. A conservative is somebody who wants to hold on to something, who wants to conserve something. And so to the extent that any Black conservative, let alone a white conservative, preaches that the way forward in this country for civil and political rights, especially for those who have had their rights denied them, the way forward is by going back, is by looking back and obviously not holding on to everything. Slavery, after all, is back there. I don't want to hold on to that, but to hold on to the things that the founders got right. To that extent, that was Douglass's meal ticket. When he was asked one time, if you were president, you know, and he was laughing when he heard that, if you were president, what would be the driving principle of your administration? And Douglass said, equal protection under the law. Right? Equal protection under the law. And so some form, and here's where my answer gets controversial, I'm sure, some form of a colorblind constitution would be what Douglass would favor. And now remember what I said about let us alone, okay? That meant you needed to guarantee that the playing field was truly fair, truly equal, okay? And so that meant voting, that meant, you know, desegregating public accommodations. That meant looking for a job. That meant looking for an education. That these things, we needed to politically remove any of the obstacles that were racial. And in so doing, he thought anybody now has the opportunity to step two. And so there would be things that Douglass would remind us of that we needed to hold on to. But most likely, I mean, this guy was, we can't lose sight of the fact that this is a man who freed himself. You try that. He was an outlaw for years before, in the eyes of the law, he was manumitted. And so this was, Douglass, in short, was an activist. And so he was not going to be someone who was simply, you know, mouthing political pieties. He would be today champing at the bit against any law, constitutional interpretation, or social practice that treated any portion of the population as if it was inferior to any other portion. That's a big question, and sure, it would need to be teased out more and get into specifics. So okay. I hope that got us down that road.
Okay, another big question, but I think intelligible. So it's a question about what institutions were needed following the Civil War for newly freed slaves to make the transition to full citizenship? And the question also is, are any of those institutions that were needed then still possibly still needed today for African Americans living in the United States?
My answer is going to sound pretty basic and uncontroversial, which is a good thing given what we just talked about. He would say schools. The education, he said he knew this as a slave when he was barely learning to read, when the master told his wife, "You can't, what are you doing? Why are you teaching little Freddie," as she called him? What are you teaching him? Why are you teaching him to read? Don't you know that will unfit him to be a slave? It makes it harder for us to treat a human being as an animal, right? At that point, she became a tyrant to him. She went from angel to devil, right, on a dime. So one of his most famous speeches later in life was one called "The Blessings of Liberty and Education." And in that speech, he said, we need two things: schools and churches, real churches, churches that actually believe and practice the gospel. But for him, education, I mean, blacks needed it not because they were black. Blacks needed it because that's what human beings need. That's the key to civilization. That's the key to moral habituation and intellectual development. Education, education, education. So for him, it's schools. When you talk about churches, you're talking about cultural influences. And now you're talking about not just life on earth, but life in the great beyond, your relationship to your creator. And so that was part of it as well. But for Douglass, I mean, look, here's the proof. What did white people in the South do everything in their power not to allow? Precisely that, schools. You had scores, hundreds of abolition-minded, a lot of women, in fact, who went south to live and to work as teachers for the what were known as the freedmen and women. And while the federal government was there protecting them and protecting the black families, they thrived. But as soon as those forces left, of course, the teachers left as well because their lives were in danger. And so what's remarkable is these are former slaves. If you're an enslaved person, you have the least advantageous circumstances to developing moral and intellectual virtue, to put it simply, in Aristotle's terms. And yet, it didn't take much for them to learn and to develop, both in their souls and in their minds. And that's precisely where the bigots of the South attacked. They cut that off at the knees because they knew this would be the grand upsetting of the racial apple cart that was the South.
Okay, there's a follow-up from the person who asked the question about Black conservative thought today. What I think the person, the way I would frame it in view of what you've just said, is would you say that thinkers such as the names that are mentioned here, Shelby Steele, Thomas Sowell, Jason Riley, Larry Elder, thinkers such as they, Candace Owens, Coleman Hughes, Glenn Lowry, would their emphasis be on education in the way that you were just stressing? Do you think that's an accurate characterization?
I know some of those gentlemen better than others, and I have not seen anything that they have said or written. And I think of the writings of those gentlemen, I know Shelby Steele's the best. I don't see anything that Steele, let alone Sowell or Lowry or McWhorter, have written or said that would contradict what I just said about Douglass's conservatism. That said, I feel bad saying that and not making it a fair fight. I know if David Blight, and David's a friend of mine, David Blight were here, I'm pretty sure he would give you a different answer. His own biography has a footnote where he goes after Clarence Thomas, and Clarence Thomas is probably the most famous Black conservative in America. And Blight goes after Thomas and Thomas's use of Frederick Douglass. And so let's just say there are other opinions. I mean, it goes without saying, there are other opinions than mine on Douglass and what kind of politics or partisanship he would exhibit today.
Okay. Another question, if you feel if you're willing to answer this, has to do with your institution, Washington Lee University. The question
Sure.
is, I'm guessing you get this periodically. Washington and Lee
Read the
University
New York Times.
should change its name. That's the question. Do you think Washington?
The short version is Google my name and Richmond Times Dispatch. I wrote an editorial. I think it was published June or July on this subject, where I argue that our slaveholding namesakes, George Washington and Robert E. Lee, their names should not be removed from the university. That both in their own ways, there aren't two gentlemen who had an impact on the survival and flourishing of the university, who is now my employer, has been my employer for 21 years. There are no two figures who have had the kind of impact that led to the thriving of my school more than George Washington and Robert E. Lee. I think your audience knows I'm a Lincoln guy. The only American I love more than Douglas was Abraham Lincoln. I think Lee was a traitor, and I'm willing to debate anybody on that. That said, my institution, as long as I've taught there, and that's since 1999, is not a bastion of white supremacy. We don't worship Lee as the patron saint of the lost cause. And Lee's impact, the 5 years that he led Washington College at the time, it was before they added the law school, which was part of his idea. They annexed the law school to it. That was his job, 1865 till his death in 1870. And he was not forward thinking on the race question. That's clear. No doubt about that. He was, to put it politely, an old Southern patrician when it came to the color line. But in terms of speaking to the South in a way that dissuaded them from pursuing guerrilla warfare, from pursuing an ongoing civil war, he was, I'll say, and I'm going to get flack for this, but that's okay. I've got tenure. He was a reconciliationist of sorts. He's not Ulysses Grant. Okay. Please quote that. But he was one who said, we have to come as one nation now. He didn't want monuments to himself. He accepted students from both North and South, patronage North and South. And so for that, not for his assuming command of the Army of Northern Virginia and then ultimately of the Confederate Army, not for his racial bigotry, not for everything he did to try to destroy this country. I don't honor him for that. And our university doesn't honor him for that. They honor him for what he did as president of what was known at the time as Washington College, at a time when it had maybe 50 students. It had over 400 when his presidency was over. It was put on a financially sound basis. So if you want a more coherent answer, read my editorial. But no, I am not in favor of them changing the name. The trustees just met last week. They meet in February, and I'm sure I wasn't a faculty rep there, and I'm on sabbatical. I don't know their determinations, but they will have heard from a subcommittee on which the president serves ex officio to consider the question whether the university should change its name. And of course, it's not just removing Lee. The faculty motion was to remove Lee from the namesake, but what do we become then? Washington and fill in the blank. They have a task on their hands, which is not simply yay or nay on Lee. It's then, well, what do we call ourselves if we remove the name? And if I were a betting man, I wouldn't know the odds here. The name change would require a 2/3 vote of all of the trustees, and so we'll see what they say.
Okay. Regrettably, we're just about out of time, but this was a remarkably wide-ranging discussion. So
Great.
thank you again, Professor Morel. Thank you to the audience members who submitted questions. I think this was a wonderful opportunity to hear your views on many contemporary matters. So we're profoundly grateful. I can applaud you in my own way, and I'm sure that everybody in the audience would be.
Thank you.
Post-COVID, we very much hope that you will visit us at King's because this has been terrific. Audience, please tell your friends. This is being recorded, and in short order, it will be released. So there'll be an opportunity for people who could not join us today to watch the video. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Good afternoon to all. So bye-bye.